Well, hello, everybody, dear friends. It's good to be together again. We call our group Living into Inclusivity. My name is James Allgard, and I live in Wenatchee. I am also pastor at Grace Lutheran Church, an ELCA congregation in our valley, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And so it's my turn to be facilitator. I guess I didn't put my finger to my nose fast enough. But we're all taking turns to, really share the load of responsibility of facilitating. But we do know that this is a communal conversation for sure. And judging off of our most recent session, we know that one comment or one story will lead down other paths. And so I think probably as we respond to our reflection questions, we will have some kind of an organic flow. But if that doesn't happen right away, then we can use what we call the process of mutual invitation. So somebody will go ahead and start, and once they're finished addressing the first question, they can invite another respondent. Does everyone feel all right with that? And also, as a reminder to our greater audience, this is really, it's kind of step 2 in terms of our video presence of, I think, many steps. We've committed to really spending a whole year, 12 months. Some of the people who I've been reading or listening to have said, groups of whites, of people who have inherited a sense of privilege, ought to really try to commit to a 3 to 10 year process, which sounds kind of wild, but I think that their wisdom is greater than mine. But at least a year together. So I'm grateful for all of you, and I'm looking forward to learning from you all as we walk together. Would it be okay? Would it be important for us to just simply name ourselves and talk about maybe our presence in the community, just briefly?
I'll go ahead, and then we can just invite with mutual invitation. I'm Pastor Dave Haven from Celebration Lutheran Church in East Wenatchee. John?
John Coleman Campbell, pastor at First United Methodist Church in Wenatchee. And let's see, my friend down the street, towards town anyway, Francis.
I'm Frances Twiggs, and I'm the rector of St. Luke's Episcopal Church here in Wenatchee. And I'll invite Tom.
I am Tom Neese, and I'm currently serving on assignment as the Executive Director at Serve Wenatchee Valley. And Laura.
I'm Laura Shinham. I'm the pastor at Cascade Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. And Karen.
I'm Karen Rutherford, and I am a engaged, hopefully, community member.
Awesome.
Rufus.
Yeah.
I think we have one more.
Yes, Karen. Yes, you are the engaged community member.
Wake up, I've got to get into the groove here. Sorry,
Okay.
I'm late. I
It's
apologize.
okay. Rufus Woods, yeah, I'm a columnist with Wenatchee World, and also somewhat involved community member. Excited to be here.
Great, thank you, everybody. And as a reminder, we're having deeply personal conversations, but we're choosing to be transparent and just invite the greater community along with us. And so we're grateful for any helpful contributions as we continue to go together. We were challenged or invited to listen to a podcast. The host of the podcast is Krista Tippett. The name of the podcast is On Being, and it's an interview that she did with a trauma therapist, a member of the Black community who lives in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, by the name of Resmaa Menakem. I probably butchered his name, but just tremendous insight in terms of our where we are in our nationwide struggle and our community-wide struggle with race, and some of the things that we struggle with as people who have white privilege, or white body privilege is a term that he introduces to us. And we were asked to reflect on a few questions. And the first question is, when did you know you were white? And I'm just going to open it up so that anybody who feels ready to answer can go ahead. When did you know you were white?
When that question, was asked, it's like it's a very similar question actually to when did you become a Christian for me, because I didn't have a crisis moment of faith entrance. I was born into a faith tradition, and just sort of, while I can go back and piece through certain times of different commitment, similarly, it was a little bit of a struggle, but I did go back to a time I was probably 8, 9 years old. 8, 9 years old, 8 to 10 anyway. And I was in Laguna Beach, California, and my uncle, whose name is actually the same as mine, Tom Neese, he started an outreach in Washington, D.C. Called the Community of Hope. And he was reaching out and helping, that community of all different, races. And he came to visit us in Laguna Beach. And to my parents' horror, with all of the family sitting around, I began to tell Black jokes. I mean, I just started, and I was, 8 to 10 years old. I was very, innocently, telling jokes. But I read the room fairly early after about 2 or 3, and realized that was not important. And I proceeded to be chastised, by my uncle for that, for that mindset. And I think that was the earliest moment where I had that awakening. And it took at 10 years old, how can failures be epic? But for me, I still carry that. I still remember that. I still actually carry a degree of shame with that, to a certain degree, that is obviously running in the background, because that's the first thing that came to my mind when I took a look at this question. So, Rufus, how about you? I'm not sure if that's the way you want to do this, James. If you want to assign, or just keep it open. But
that sounds good. Thanks, Tom.
Yep, this works great. Thanks.
I grew up in Wenatchee, and grew up, and it was extremely white when I grew up. It was I can't remember more than a couple kids of color in our high school, and it just wasn't a thing. I don't know if there's one moment when I said, "Oh wow, I'm white," because I would see difference, right? I'd say, I went to college, and I worked on the newspaper there, and the editor was African American woman, and so I remember her saying, "Wow," she said, "I saw your name, I thought you might be a brother," and so be Black, because Rufus is a common name in the Black community, and I also had that experience with a girl I dated in college who invited me home for Thanksgiving, and her parents, who I later found out, who were from Arkansas, had the conversation. What do we do if Rufus is Black? And to their horror and shame, because they're very upright, wise folks. But I didn't really. It just was I didn't really notice it, because I didn't really see why. I saw others as people of color. It didn't resonate with me, and so I didn't even put myself into a racial category. race was somebody else, right? And I think I've kind of just mindlessly that became my experience, and it didn't really dawn on me that I was white. It just was, right? And so I would pass it along to Francis.
Remember
You'll
your
need to
Francis.
unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, folks. Thanks, Rufus. So when did I realize I was white? I don't know that I can remember being put in a position where I had to realize I was white in the way that I'm reading that question. I grew up in a suburban area in the south of Tennessee, and there were no Black people or even any other people of color in the school. So what I had was being told by my mother primarily about at certain points in my life, racial injustices and those things. I remember reading early on. I'm not sure how. Maybe this came out in '70. I don't know how old I was, but it was like a very quick biography of Martin Luther King Jr. And so reading that, and it's really different. Well, the story that I remember from that book was how, as a young child, he had these two little white friends that he played with when he was, 4 or 5 years old. He played with them. And then they were like a year older, and they had to go to first grade. They went to school. And so he waited for them to come home, and he went and he knocked on their door, and the mother came to him and said, "They are not going to be playing with you anymore." And so he had to learn he was Black through that experience, and how he went home and cried to his mom, and so when I think about that kind of experience for a child to have, I know I haven't had that kind of experience to know I was white. I'll invite David.
Thank you, Francis. I think of two things where, I don't know, I'm kind of like the rest of you, or I'm not sure when I realized it, but I realized the differentiation. We grew up 5 miles from an Indian reservation. And so in the big town, and this is in North Dakota, that we would go to for shopping was on the reservation. And so when we would drive through, when we'd visit, when we'd interact, I realized that I was different. My color was different, our culture was different. So I realized there was something different. I didn't distinguish between, that I was necessarily white, but there was a difference. And the other thing was when we'd visit relatives in Minneapolis, my grandparents lived in a neighborhood that was fairly diversified, but having never seen a Black person in rural North Dakota, this was different for me. And so I noticed the Black people in the neighborhood, and I realized I was different. And so those were the two things that I could remember from that particular, or for that particular question, that I realized I was white. So how about you, John?
Yes, thank you, David. Yeah, like you, Rufus, I grew up in a town that hardly had any non-white presence. There was one family, an interracial couple with some children my age or near my age, and well, I think you know, they were fairly well-respected family. In high school, I guess one experience, though, I guess before I drop the one, I guess I don't know that I knew myself as white then. It was more I knew I wasn't them, which may not be the same as knowing I'm white. In my age, where I grew up, where I went to school, I, along with everyone else in the school, read To Kill a Mockingbird and discussed that, and that was certainly one of my introductions to race in America. But probably most profoundly where I knew I was white was when I was the only one who wasn't black or some other color, working Peace Corps Southern Africa, where I'd go 2 months without ever seeing another white person. And certainly a position, being a foreigner, being an American, being white, came with some privilege there. But it also, when I got out of that context and came home to America, it was kind of like, well, I don't know that I want to be them either. What that group that I was part of or am part of, yeah, being American anyway, not just white, any American in Africa at that time, certainly Peace Corps volunteer. They had lots of problems there, wonderful people, but if problems got serious, I could always go home. I could always leave. That was part of the privilege. They didn't, you know, if civil war broke out, whatever, or pandemics, that was their home. They didn't have the privilege, so it certainly knew I was different. Saw African Americans go to Africa thinking they would be just like the Africans, and many of them found out they weren't. that they were American in more ways than they knew too. So anyway, Karen, how about you?
Hey, I found this to be a very interesting question. I like everyone has said, it's kind of hard to think about just something you take for granted, the color of your skin. I think my first time that I really noticed, or it hit me, so to speak, I don't think notice is even the right word, was I was probably about 9, 10 years old or so, and was traveling through the South with my family. I think we were in Alabama, and we came up, we needed to have a rest stop, and stopped at the gas station, and there was a white bathroom and a colored bathroom. It was a first for me. I still remember it. It's kind of like seared into my brain even. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I see the sign of it. It's crazy. And I think it was the first time I ever questioned, well, what's that? Why are there different bathrooms, you know? And I think to me it was, I'm not even certain if at that point I recognized I was white, but that I recognized that there was this difference in how people were expected to live their lives. And I think that was my really first startling time that, and it was kind of like, wow, take notice. What is this? And it stayed with me. I would say the time that it really profoundly probably hit me was in college, and we had some family friends who's had a child my age who married a black man, and that was all aghast. And I can remember even in my own gut, feeling kind of like, ooh, I wonder how that'll work out. I mean, what will their children be like? I mean, I can remember questioning myself. I mean, I'm thinking, wow, that was brave of her. What will that be like? And it's interesting to think that wasn't really probably my first journey into actually thinking about that obviously that if I felt that way, I felt that there must be differences in the way people would live and how they would be treated, and society and histories. And so that probably was really the first time it really profoundly sunk in that all things are not as they appear and all things are not created equal. So it was probably me. So I'll pass the baton on to Laura.
Thank you, Karen. So I grew up in what I would consider rural California. Yes, there is a rural California. Small towns, very small towns, and a lot of agriculture. Reminds me a lot of Wenatchee. And so we had a lot of people from Mexico, from Central America, and I grew up with a lot of agricultural workers around. So I didn't really see differences then. We all went to the same school, we all played, all that kind of stuff. It wasn't until I was in a community college class in Oakland, California. And it was a class, I was learning child development, and we were talking about genetics. And the professor was an African-American woman who I was just in awe of, because, wow, to have a professor that was an African-American woman was just mind-blowing. And she asked the question, what eye color do you think is dominant? And the eager student that I was raised my hand and said blue eyes, because that's what I knew. And she immediately dispelled my understanding of that. And that was the first time I, very similar to what you were talking about, Tom, I still feel like the guilt and the shame of being so eager to name, oh, my blue eyes are dominant. And really having to step back and re-examine my worldview and how naive I was of the world. So that's when I started realizing my place in my skin color in this whole idea of race. Sheila?
Hey everyone, lost track of time, so thanks for letting me in. I shared both of these things, I think, when we were talking earlier, but I will say that really didn't have any exposure to anyone other than white folks growing up in a rural portion of Minnesota. But I would go and share vacation time with my cousins in Wisconsin each summer, and I was probably 10 or 11 years old when I went and we went camping with, and they had two Black gals from Detroit that were staying with them on some kind of church exchange program. We all went camping, and Draw Straws were the best place to be inside the trailer tent that we were in. There were 5 of us, so 2 double beds and 1 single space. And I drew a straw to share a double space with Pinky. Their names were Pinky and Sue. And I remember asking her if she thought her skin color would rub off on me or vice versa, because I just didn't have any frame of reference for that. And bless her, we're all the same age, and she could have said anything, but what she said was, well, let's just try it and see what happens. And I certainly saw color all through my life. I will say that my deep understanding of what that actually meant in terms of privilege really didn't sink in until I was in a diversity quarter as part of my chaplain residency in 2014. I got it, but I didn't get it until then. I didn't understand that lower middle class, blue collar, all of that wouldn't make me equal to a Black person with the same upbringing, that there was privilege inherent in the skin I was born into, and that was a game changer for me. Lots of other incidences in between, but that was the real reality check that changed the way I looked at things. And I don't know, am I the last one for that question? I don't know who was speaking beforehand, so Laura, maybe you can help me out.
Well, actually, it would be me. But now as facilitator, don't I have the opportunity to just kind of skip whatever questions are the, oh, I see. Yes, so I know it sounds, well, it might sound a little bit kind of too distant from me, but I actually, the way that I need to start this question about realizing I'm white is to actually talk a little bit about my family history. So I have Scandinavian background, and the background that I have the most kind of narrative connection with is the Norwegian side. And one of my grandpa's brothers, actually one of my grandpa's sisters, was the mother of a boy, a man who whose father was German. So this birth happened in World War II era under occupied Norway. So in Norwegian society, there's this concept or a label, I guess they say, children who were born of Nazi occupiers and Norwegian citizens are called lost children or the lost generation. And so I have a great uncle who's, I guess in a sense, a kind of a half uncle, but a great uncle who's still living, but he was one of the lost children. And so as I heard that story and learned a little bit more about about World War II, about Nazi Germany, about their beliefs around the so-called Aryan race, I realized that as being somebody who's of Scandinavian heritage, I'm actually preferred. And so that realization and the sick realization of that has really stuck with me, to be preferred by people who had committed such atrocities. So my family history, in a sense, informs me. I also so realizing that I'm a preferred race, I'll also be honest and say that, you know, it feels kind of nice to be preferred. So there is a little sprinkling of pride in that, which I feel actually really quite ashamed to speak aloud. But that exists in me as I think through it. And then in my own life, growing up in a fairly monoculture area of the Midwest, but having Hispanic, Latino people also sharing the community with us, we would oftentimes have classmates who had a Hispanic background. And so this one boy named Armando, he was always happy, he was always joyful, but he was pretty gullible, and we could really prey on his kindness and on his gentle spirit. So I think I realized the power that came with my whiteness when we would come in from football practice, and this is late October, early November in Minnesota, northern Minnesota, and everybody is just freezing. Their hands are just so frigid. And Armando's hands were so cold and he didn't know what to do with them. And we said, oh, Armando, here's what you do. You turn on the hot water tap and then you put your hands under the water and it'll warm up your hands really quick. so he did that, right, and experienced the pain of that. And we knew absolutely that we were victimizing him. Yeah, so those are a few of my own stories, but I think also what's behind that super innocent question, when did you know you were white, is also an invitation to think about white as being not so much a color, but a culture, to be a participant in a system. And I don't know if you all, the rest of you, caught that a bit, but would it be okay to maybe just speak to, is there anybody who has a thought to share regarding that?
Just to clarify, James, kind of changing the question a little bit to when did we realize we were part of the white culture system? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that's talked about in this interview is white women's tears, right? That white women can cry and the world will move. And that's part of our system. That's part of why white bodies are protected. White bodies are built, their systems are built to protect and keep white bodies comfortable and safe and all of those things. And I remember hearing that term or hearing that idea for the first time and realizing all the times that I had done it. All the times where in a conversation and in the moment, I remember in the moment feeling that I was being empathetic, that I was trying to, that I was really understanding what this person was going through. And so therefore I was moved to tears. And in actuality, I was pulling the attention away from what the experience was. And so that's how I've seen myself, as well as all the other countless ways of just being a participant in our current structures. I mean, right now, our current structures and calling the police when not being safe. And I remember living in Oakland and moving my purse when I would see a person of color to the other side, and thinking that it was unconscious, but knowing for real that it wasn't. So yes, there's multiple examples of how I have been in that, complicit in that system.
Thank you.
It seems to me that the well, if we talk about the white culture, but then kind of segue into the term white supremacy or supremacy body, even the term supremacy, the supreme, seems to be on top of everything else, and so there's sort of a vertical chasm, a vertical separation that happens, this hierarchical system, where if you're on top and you're supreme, it's really difficult to know what it's like below you. It's like if you're in a boat in a lake or whatever, you have no idea what's underneath, really. You're just floating there, and it's until you get down deep into the water that you realize it's a different world, and that getting down deep is really difficult, especially if you don't want to or don't understand that there's something down there to discover.
Mm-hmm. So Dave, I think you're kind of really helping us segue into that second question. And I'm just going to go ahead and read that question for all of us. What was your initial reaction to the term white supremacy? How does it change with Resmaa, who is the one who was interviewed, with Resmaa's term, white supremacy body. So, Dave,
I
do you?
have to make a correction there.
Okay.
White body supremacy, that the white body became supreme. So I switched the terms there in the question.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Yeah, white body supremacy. Dave, since you kind of headed in that direction, is there anything more that you want to share there?
Well, I guess I think of that question, how does it change with the term white body supremacy? Where am I in this body? You know, how do I exist in this body, and how did this white body become the standard by which every other body is evaluated by? The first question that he asked there about what was your initial reaction to the term white supremacy, I think that goes back to what I said earlier about it being a term of vertical hierarchical status. Whereas when you talk about being the body, then it hits home. It's just not a term, the intellectual term. And so I really have to pay attention then to where am I in this world? I guess that would be just a short, brief answer for that.
Would you like to invite the next responder?
Sure. Tom, how about you?
You know, as I have been pondering through this, and it's very difficult, I think, for all of us. I know we're not at the place to say what you pulled out of this, but one of those things is the practice of taking an inventory about where you are, and those visceral reactions that come to the forefront, you know, immediately are things to pay attention to, and they're kind of the beginning point that Resmaa, I think, you know, guides us toward, and that's pretty powerful. So I don't know how that affects my initial reaction, but when I'm looking at the term white supremacy, I'm looking at supremacy as the predominant term and white as the adjective to describe supremacy. And the reason that I feel like I do that is because on a global scale, supremacy takes place in different cultures regardless of white or black. For instance, Palestinian or Jewish supremacy in the Middle East. There's been that battle that has been going on. If you look back into you know, the history of Rwanda in the late 80s, early 90s, there was Hutu and Tutsi supremacy. And so this sense of supremacy then takes on a different perspective when you look at white as the adjective. And in our culture, that is what we have to be honest with and deal with, and that's what we're I think looking at here as a group of folks, to see how that white body supremacy and how we are complicit with it. But the supremacy part to me is probably more foundational to me, a human issue, than it is a race issue. It's and I heard Resmaa bring that up in his presentation, is approaching this from a human standpoint, and I like that law of irreducible complexity in things like this. And so to reduce that down to the complexity of human beings, that I think we long to be in that place of supremacy because of the comfort it brings. Resmaa talked about that comfort that comes from being in that place of supremacy, and I think all of us have enjoyed that place of supremacy because it has offered us that level of comfort. I think about, now this is maybe socioeconomic, maybe it's race directed, but how many of you, if you had a $500 bill that you didn't know how to pay, have a support network that you could go to and help find resources to be able to take care of that? I mean, I would say probably all of us would raise our hand and to answer that question. But that I think plays into the system of the white body, supremacy that we have been able to keep control and keep a level of comfort that moves us forward, as opposed to being that vulnerable with no place to go. Right? You can't, as John said earlier about being down in Africa, if something happened, he had an escape route. And so I think that that escape route that we have, that way out, and I think that causes us to hide in the shadows a bit, because having this conversation and exploring that has a way of perhaps shaking our security system. This can fundamentally change that, that security system, inside of us. And man, we as human beings don't want to let go of that, I don't think. But I think it's really directed by our humanity first, and then expresses itself as a white body supremacy, I think. But so those are my thoughts around that. I'm gonna ask Sheila to join us and chime in.
So interestingly enough, I was working on some continuing education for requirements for pastors in the United Methodist Church, and the course was entitled, or is entitled, Anti-Racism 101. And inside that course is a conversation about God creating the human race equally, which is, what we believe, and a note that a 16th century anatomist, Blumenbach, established the race classifications that we live with today. And I can see heads nodding. I guess I wasn't aware of that, but it dovetailed, all those centuries ago, the pattern was pulled that put white, or the Caucasian race, at the top, theoretically, of how races and humans were classified, and it's stayed that way ever since. So when I think about that relative to what Resmaa's interview was talking about, in My Grandmother's Hands, I was like, gosh, there it is. That's a more tangible way of stepping into this idea of decontextualized culture that's just inherent and carried from generation to generation, whether we know it or not. I will say that for me, white supremacy, I can feel myself just push back and not want to be a part. My ears have always heard it as a political radical faction, as opposed to white body supremacy, which is what Resmaa is talking about, that says, well, no, that we're a part of that by virtue of the color of our skin and learned things inherent in our being, passed down generation to generation to generation. And that allows me to hear more readily things like Tom's reflection. And I like what you said about just the notion of the boat and not knowing what's underneath it. If I step into that term in the context that it's presented here, there's so much underneath that to really grab onto and understand and own that that's the place that sits in me around that right now. And I would invite Karen.
Mute myself here. This was an interesting question also. I go back to the word, when we talk about white body supremacy, I go back to the word fear for some reason. It's that fear, that crossing of the street, that moving your purse, that word of fear, and why is it with a white body? And I have for my own personal thing, I always go back to history. When did it start? I was fascinated. I actually picked up his book to read. I can't pronounce his name either. I've got it right here, Grandma's Hands. and it talks a lot about going back into history and the history, our culture and our historical culture too. And for myself personally, so I started to do a little bit of research into my own past because I knew it was there, just wasn't spoken about. My family, my father's family, three of my grandparents were Norwegian and one has been in the United States since Jamestown. So I've got both ends of the spectrum. The one from Jamestown, my father's side of the family, which is my name, my maiden name, Judkins, were here a long time, and they actually owned slaves. They came over as tradesmen, and then had a small plantation. And one thing that we were always quite proud of in our family, this is so fascinating because now it just baffles me, was, I don't know if you've heard of Bacon's Rebellion, but Bacon's Rebellion, and I had to look up the date again, in 1676. We were so proud as our family that our name is written in the history book, the Judkins, and my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, so I think 10 times removed, was the constable, and he helped take place with Nathan Bacon. Off they stormed to get their rights, better security from those Native American Indians, and to make Berkeley, the governor, help them. And it was a fascinating story in our family always, I was so proud of it. Until I learned just recently the incredibly dark side of Bacon's Rebellion. On Bacon's Rebellion, in the end, my family they were commuted. Their sentences were, they didn't have to serve anything. My great-great-great-great-grandfather went back to being the constable. The black men that fought alongside him weren't. And that was really the time when black, your color of your skin, down to whether you had a drop of black in your skin, came to be separate. You had different laws, you had different ways of being, and it was Bacon's Rebellion was the first time that it really instructed that teaching in America. And I thought, oh my God, talk about an interesting thing for white supremacy. Something we'd been so proud of, and then to read more about it. So that is, to me, why? Why did that happen? And a lot of it had to do with economics and fear for the South. That was their economy was based off of free labor. You paid for it and then it stayed with you forever. And the thought they could rebel and the thought that they might go out on their own was terrifying. And I think that, you talk about, he talks about in his podcast, in his book, about that fear in your soul of, that it probably with my family started then, that fear of Black people and the fear of them taking something that was rightfully yours and your place higher up on the scheme of things. So personally for me, it's been a really fascinating journey. I've actually gone and found some on the internet, some first person narratives of that, which is fascinating that they have those back in Virginia, the archives, and just to explore it. But I think it's like ACEs, the childhood ACEs. It lives with you. It's there with you, that fear.
Say, Karen, if I could just, there's a book by Ibram Kendi entitled Stamped from the Beginning. And it speaks right to that history that you're referring to. And so that would be a good, it's a really nice, thick book, but it's not going to be an overnight read. But
and that's what started this journey, was I was reading that book. Okay,
yeah. So
I was, and actually I have to be perfectly honest with you. I have the big, fat, thick one. And I also have, as a lover of young adult literature, there's also a young adult version.
Okay.
So I have to confess, I read the young adult version as a truly newbie in this white world. I had to read the young adult version to understand it. But he talks about Bacon's Rebellion, and that's what started me on this quest. Great book, great book. I love that man, great man. Yeah. And I pick, where do we go? Who's next? Laura.
Thank you, Karen. So to talk about the comfort and when you start addressing white supremacy and thinking about what you have to give up to talk about it, to bring it to the forefront. I always saw it similarly to what other people have expressed, the white supremacy of the KKK, of those organizations and that label. And I would say in about 2015, it became a term in our faith tradition in Unitarian Universalism, and we were being pressured as ministers to talk about it and to bring it to our congregations. And I remember thinking, can't we find something that's not so harsh, that's not so in your face, that's not so tied to all of these other things that, because they really wanted us to look at where our place was in white supremacy. And I remember being scared. I remember being scared to bring it back to my congregation. And I remember thinking, I'm going to get fired. I'm not going to survive this conversation with my congregation about this term. And we've delved into it. It's taken a long time. I've gotten some pushback. I've made people uncomfortable. I've made myself uncomfortable. And I'm still learning. You know, it's a term that is so full of so many nuances, and I don't know how many people, one of the tools that I brought in is the iceberg, where it shows at the tip of the iceberg, the overt white supremacy, and then the bottom of it is the covert white supremacy. And Rufus, maybe I'll dig that image up and we can share it online with people. But all the things that are in that lower, behind the scenes, unknown to us, that we just play, that we just go about our days and do. And part of that. And the nuance that Resmaa brought to it with the white body supremacy was really interesting. Because then, I can't remember who said it, but it really made it visceral. It really made it, I think it was you, Dave, really made it hit home a little bit harder, because you can see when you look at that and you can start seeing all the ways that white body has been protected and lifted up and made supreme in our culture and in our society. So that's where that question hit for me. Frances?
Thank you. So, yeah, so white supremacy was always something that I was, educated that I was to work it, not be a part of, that we were not, work against my white supremacy. And so really, in that mindset, not really giving a whole lot of thought to all the different ways that I'm part of it. Never really thought about who else might have been trying to get this apartment that I got the lease on. And I think it was probably then when I was in New York and I was a seminary and I had the extension of a health insurance, and I had to go to the emergency, not the emergency room, but just in a clinic. And I was sitting there and I'd put my name down, and I was sitting there in New York City amongst really predominantly all sorts of different people of color. And I was waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally, I just thought, well, so the class is going to be coming up. Let me see if there's any way they can tell me how long the wait is going to be, and I'll just come back. So I walk up to the person and I say, do you have any idea how long it's going to be? Because I can just come back. And she said, do you have insurance? And I said, yes. And it wasn't 3 minutes later that I was called back. And there were other people that had signed in before I did. And as I went back there and I sat there in that room, I thought, oh my gosh, what just happened? Because I jumped the line. And so it's really, caused me to start thinking about how all these pieces of the culture work together to get me that place in line. And that's kind of when I heard the speaking, Resmaa, about white body supremacy, that's what it was like, because that was my white body that went up there and said, how long is it going to take? That's what really came to mind for me.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about when I do think about some of the historical pieces, I always go back to the doctrine of discovery and how throughout this globe, white people got put at the top of the line by that doctrine of discovery, even on the African continent.
Mm-hmm. So Francis, you're reminding me of something that I want to make sure I mention, but I also want to make sure that you're finished with your reflection.
Yeah.
Maybe Karen can help, but I in terms of medical understanding, we understand that a cancer is a quickly growing cell. So metastasis is growing out of proportion of the rest of the body system, in a sense. It's outgrowing its neighbors. And when I'm getting a sense of when European societies started to figure things out in terms of economic development, industry, manufacturing, it's set into motion this idea of mining the world for resources. And so there's this sense that European culture advanced so much more quickly than in those terms than other societies. So then Africa began to be mined for black bodies, right? So it makes me just wonder out loud if white supremacy or whiteness as a cultural piece is actually a metastasis in the human community. And I'm not sure what to do with that. Because, I've got lots of older relatives and acquaintances that remember growing up poor in maybe the Depression era, and we're very, very happy. We're very happy, and I think what was void from that experience was a very, very wealthy neighbor. Part of why they were so happy is that they weren't able to compare themselves to John J. Hill, right? Or so there's economics built into this. There's domination, and going to the front of the line. That's a hard one, and it just makes me right now feel agitated. To just try some thoughts on for size and try some words on for size. I think recently I've had a realization that my actual appearance, I'm a tall guy, I'm 6'1". I'm a man, I have white skin. My actual physical presence in a community could bring about a reaction of fear to my neighbor, because they might assume something of me. And so it makes me wonder, so in white communities, how many negative experiences with a Black community or a Black person does it take for you to start to develop this program of fear in how you respond to difference around you? And vice versa, how many negative experiences in the Black community does it take for them to begin to lose trust in their white neighbors? So I'm kind of sitting with that too myself.
James?
Yeah.
I really appreciate what you're saying, because I, again, went back to say, looking at the past and how did it start and where did it pop up, so to speak. It brought to mind another book that I'd read long ago, so I can't quote it well, but it was Guns, Germs, and Steel from Jared Diamond, if anyone remembers that. But it really is that the three things that us white people, us Europeans, brought to the table were guns and germs and steel, and through those three things we truly did dominate the world. Then the economic part and then the fear of losing your position. I think that is such a good one. I want to go back and reread that book now, because it holds some keys for my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, we cry out at biological warfare, but we understand, certainly, if we look back into our country's history, that biological warfare was part of dominating the West, and also a governing framework or ideology that says that I can actually be the owner of a chunk of land, whereas that was such a foreign idea to Native peoples, and they were brought to a negotiating table and every single ace was in the white man's hand, period.
Fascinating.
So, right?
There's another book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein that kind of chronicles the kind of to what you were talking about, James, in terms of from the get-go, but this is specifically in metropolitan areas, in red zone, laws and different things that basically discriminated against people of color. I mean, it's a good read, called The Color of Law.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to jump in on something, James, you said that just kind of react to a little bit, and it was that something to the effect that that's bad, that experiences, people may experience us or we may experience others, and I think what a dynamic that's really at play is the acculturation, the messages, the signals, how we're socialized into this system that aren't about specific experiences, but about necessarily, but that sort of, and I think he speaks to this, with the term white body supremacy, the operationalizing, what the fact that the white body is the standard, and that any other body is deviant from that standard. And that really, and he raised the question in his interview, which I thought was just fascinating. When he told the story of being in an audience and saying, "How many of you believe in diversity?" Everyone said yes. And then he asked, "Diverse from what?" And it was such a rich, it's diverse from white, right? It's the assumed reality that we live in, and that I mean, to me, I mean, when I think of the term white supremacy, I think of torches, lynchings, bad people doing bad things, being very direct and intentionally inflicting harm. And that's what I think most of our society looks at this issue, or a lot of folks do. They look at this and say, well, I'm not that, right? The white body supremacy operationalizes it in the terms of Resmaa Menakem, by acknowledging the hardly ever stated, almost never stated reality that that's the standard, and that we, all of us, and folks like us, we're the standard, and everything else is less than, other than. So, and that's the way I really took that whole question of supremacy, white body supremacy versus white supremacy, and the white body supremacy being so much easier for me to go, oh yeah, I start to get, as we've discussed, the sort of how systems get developed and how we end up at the front of the line for resources. And you know, here's just a really tiny example of how things work. Columbia Elementary here, talking with the principal and counselor this last year, and having him say, we're talking about how to engage the community and their parents. And they were telling me about the fact that there's a 5th grade school district track meet, and their kids show up ragtag, hardly have, you know, ill-fitting shoes, many of them. I mean, and other schools in the district will show up with like uniforms, and the messages, those signals, those not explicit signals send about being less than, not being good enough, and being other than. Anyway, that was my take on that. John, did you have anything you wanted to add as far as the white supremacy versus white body supremacy issue?
I'm probably got too many thoughts that none of them will make sense, but provoked by all your thoughts, certainly. The whole terminology, the white body supremacy, I guess, is kind of new thought. And then before I'd thought of, you know, probably white person or personality or something where I have a choice. White body, I don't know that I get a choice there, so I have to deal with that. Where some of that may play out is as a white person, white body person, I see nuance, I guess, in supremacy. You know, when like he indicated, white woman's tears, the white woman gets killed or disappears in North Carolina, it makes news in Wenatchee. You know, a Native American woman disappears on the Yakima Reservation, and we may never hear about it. You know, but you know, when Laura, you're talking about your own tears and experience, I wonder if a lot of that is learned to gain some kind of more equal footing with the white men in your life, or whatever, that's the way you've learned to cope with maybe being put down, oppressed, whatever terminology you want to use there. So for somebody who's below that boat, though, David, those nuances may not mean much. You know, we're still on the bottom. Resmaa talked about poor white folk, kind of, I don't know what the term was, it wasn't co-opted or whatever, but decided that they could at least get some privileges by identifying with the white folk rather than with the economic class that they might be in. So, so the powerful, rich white folk kind of have a way of pitting us against each other in a way, I suppose. So anyway, those are a few of my thoughts, and if I go any farther, I'll start babbling.
I'd like to invite you, John, to maybe be the first person with that third question then. What is your I guess your takeaway? What resonated you with this interview, and then what questions do you still have I feel like this is, in some sense, a real continuation of some of our earlier thoughts.
Say that again.
What resonated with you in
With
this
the
interview?
interview that we listened to? No.
And yep, and what questions do you still have?
Huh. Let's see. I wrote some things down. I guess the idea of being a trauma therapist, I had never heard of such a thing before, I guess, and defining a lot of his thoughts on race in terms of trauma, and hadn't thought about that. I certainly, you know, lived and worked in near Joint Base Lewis McChord for a few years, and saw soldiers come back with PTSD and that kind of trauma, and known certainly women who've been raped and whatnot, and trauma that defines much of their behavior and thoughts and actions, whatever. Hadn't thought of that as part of something, though, that gets passed down from one generation to another somehow. But I think I need to think about that more and consider it, certainly. So anyway, I'm gonna throw it to go back reverse order. How about Rufus?
Rufus, you muted yourself instead of unmuted.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, thank you. So I think I think I agree with John. One thing that really jumped out that I need to think more about is the sort of generational aspect of trauma, and I'm quite familiar with trauma, and especially in the ACEs studies, the adverse childhood experiences studies, and the impact, and I do see that generational things get passed down, and Resmaa is talking about generational trauma that gets transmitted cellularly, and I need to think more about that. I'm not going to discount that. I think I keep an open mind on that. And it wouldn't surprise me that, as he put it, that when you are the deviant, you know, in your body is the culture is deeming you as deviant, that the fear and gets passed down generation to generation. I think that's entirely possible. I need to think about it. So much of this resonated. I think I spoke to that. Of thinking about bodies of culture, white body supremacy, of tuning into not just the kind of the mental aspects of race and racism, but to acknowledge what's actually happening on the ground, the way we're still so segregated. The way in which, if you look at education, if you look at the achievements of people who are poor, people of color, those who come in at the lower end of the scale in terms of achievement early on leave school at the lower end of the scale. You know, invariably, with some exceptions, but mostly it's a predictor, and it's a predictor that suggests to me that we have a society we have a lot of work to do on, and a community, as a community, creating opportunities for everyone, and seeing everyone as individual, and not just allowing, well, that's just the way it is, to be the way that we continue on. So those are a few thoughts. Let's see. Tom, how about you?
Yeah, I think a lot that resonated with me resonated with you similarly. You know, we've perhaps had this conversation, you know, on our own, but I've certainly heard it a lot that I'm not a white supremacist because we've defined it in such terms as being Aryan, as you know, as being skinhead, as being KKK or whatever, and we sort of give ourselves a pass. And then because of that, it's not, you know, it's not my problem. I never owned slaves. I haven't intentionally demeaned or spoken down to, you know, someone of a different race. And so I give myself a pass, but I'm reminded, you know, as students of the Bible that many of us are, you know, that the sins of the father are visited upon the children to the third and fourth generations. And so we know that there is something that we carry from what has come before us, that I think we're inseparable, you know, from that, which Resmaa speaks about, I think, better than anyone I've heard speak it yet, by defining that white body of supremacy, that, again, that operating system, you know, if you will, that is moving in us. The other key takeaway, you know, for me is that is his connection to a physical response, a change in the voice, a change in the heartbeat, a sweating, a something that is going on the physiological side. And so again, back to your, you know, point, Rufus, this is not just a mental exercise, but the path forward then is a connecting with those and honestly asking the question, what just happened when something like that, you know, takes place, to honestly do that introspective work of, you know, what in the world just happened. There was something that happened physically in the midst of this, and that journey, I think, to me was critical. I'm jumping ahead just a little bit only because I'm looking at the clock and seeing we're at 1:30, but the practice that he spoke about was a powerful experience and expression to me. It broadened my perspective. And if I may, where's James? Can I jump ahead and just jump into that one real quick as an addendum to this?
You bet, would love to.
Okay, so, you know, for me, I was sitting at my desk looking forward during this practice, and all I could see was a mess, because my office is a disaster right now, right? And so I define this thing as a mess, and everything is, you know, chaos. I took a moment and I looked over my shoulders, took a moment to breathe, and I looked and saw order over my right shoulder. I saw it over my left shoulder, and I realized that what I was looking at and being a defining moment of me, I attached that to myself, that I'm a mess, that I'm chaos. But it gave me a broader perspective of my surroundings and allowed me to see that I am not the sum total of what my eyes are focused on at this moment in time. And so this is a practice, as well as others, that I am going to endeavor in. And then, you know, I guess in Christian terms, taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ is that journey of what just happened, you know, to me, and why was that reaction real, and do that introspective work. Because I think we've mentioned in past meetings that this begins with that introspection and taking a look inward to move forward. So it was a powerful time for me. And those are the things that I really pulled away from it. So Karen, could you share with us?
Not good at this. Show some AI thing where we nod our eyes and the mute button goes off or something. That was great, Tom. Thank you for sharing that. That was really nice. I think that with the interview, the touch when he took his grandmother's hands, and the picking of the cotton and the stories that he didn't know, and was a real takeaway for me. I think that ability to reach out and touch and feel the past in his grandmother's hands was pretty profound. It made me think about it. My mother passed away in late February, and her most precious thing the past couple of months of her life was to have lotion rubbed on her hands and her feet. And it was an interesting way that I don't think the act itself was as much as the physical touch. And I think that was a really big takeaway for me for the world we live in nowadays, in terms of how do we heal ourselves, heal our families, heal our neighborhoods, through that feeling of touch. And especially in a day of virus where you really can't touch and you can't touch, but what can you do with words, with actions, to get past that, when people drop their defenses and you drop your own defenses and go deep. That was a takeaway for me. I'll pass it on to David.
Thank you, Karen. There were two things that came to mind in response to that question, what resonated with me. And the first one was reflecting back on a seminary professor who really used this image of the figure 8, of the journey inward and a journey outward. And the journey inward was, in a sense, staring at the wall. When we did this exercise of focusing on something, and it was a inward journey. And then the turning was this outward journey. And so that was the first image that came. But the second image was of kind of our faith tradition of repentance. That basically to repent is to turn around and to see something different. And to me, that happened as well. I became more aware of my surroundings, and to have that kind of a practice where Resmaa just talked about, even when you step into a room, step into a store, wherever you're stepping into, just take a moment to pause and turn, and have your whole body turn, and see that you are not the only person in this room. And so that really resonated with me. And those two images of a journey inward, a journey outward, and then the whole idea of turning as far as repentance and seeing something different and new, and noticing that there can be something refreshing and inviting, but also dangerous when you're turning and seeing something different. It's, you got to be aware of those kind of feelings, those gut feelings that this is a danger. So those are a couple things. Let's see, I'm trying to figure out who hasn't gone here yet. Francis?
Yeah. Thanks. So I guess the resonate piece was, again, I was struck when he was talking about his grandmother's hands and how he would touch them. And what came to my mind was how I did a similar thing. My family's not a touchy family, but I have a clear memory of being with my grandmother, my father's mother. My other grandparents were in England, so I never saw them when I was little. And doing that, her skin, how we do that now. And it's not very tight at all. When I was 5 and 6, my hand was plump, and here's my grandmother with this skin. And then that memory came into my head, doing that same kind of pulling at the hand. But then what came into my head was, as he was talking about how different their hands told their story. The difference in my grandmother's hands, which, had a life of privilege, as opposed to the difference of, his grandmother's hands and the story that they told, completely different. And then I guess the piece I have questions about, because when I what I was hearing him talk when he was doing the practice was for us to notice, and this is where I want to think a little bit about the rage within us and then he said for his voice, that it sounded like he's saying that there is a white rage for people of color, and that's something I have to think about. I mean, I'm aware of a lot of my rage from different things in my life. My father's alcoholism, and certainly the rage I have felt because of our reading these things about Martin Luther King Jr., reading about the atrocities of the Native Americans, and having that kind of a rage. But as opposed to, is there indwelling that we have inherited, that part of an inherited rage of the other parts of the world, because the white people, we are a minority. So those are my questions. Who is, I'm at the same time, who is James?
Am I the last? No, okay.
More knows. James.
So I blocked out from noon to 2. So if we are way over, it is my fault for myself in terms of facilitating. So sorry about that. One thing that really touched me in his interview is I loved how he got into the neurobiological stuff and talked about the vagus nerve, the wandering nerve. So spot on, and how intuitive we can be, and how we can pick up on, especially when we're in relationship, more of a long-term relationship, where we can pick up those subtle cues. I thought that was just so lovely. And I also think that there's a tribalism that kind of snows us, it kind of clouds us over, right? So until I get to know my Latino neighbors better, they'll kind of all look the same, and how sad that is to really realize that, because we tend to stereotype and generalize others, those who are other. But anyway, to come to know people in a deeper level, and to be in tune with that nerve, I think that's pretty awesome. There's also this message that in many respects the Black community wants to, quote, be left alone. In other words, to not be managed or not be told that you have opportunity, or not, not all of this, to just basically be free and relaxed and ready to launch into the world on an equal basis. So to be left alone. And so my question is, what's the difference between being left alone and being excluded? And I kind of have my own answer to that, which I think has to do with greed and resources on behalf of those who are in power. But I'd like to continue to explore that. And then another question would be, how does scarcity thinking inform all of this work? Scarcity mentality, saying we've got to get to the front of the line because there might not be enough supply. To think about that in a macro sense, that's something that I think really deserves some attention, so that we can kind of relax away from that scarcity mentality and realize that there is abundance in this world. And then also, I think finally, when when something is being designed or planned, maybe it's an organization or a neighborhood or a community, there are things to consider like financial viability and safety, some kind of groundwork, checklists in terms of planning. Is racist or anti-racist, does that need to be also on that basic checklist because it is such an issue for us in our society, rather than it being the kind of collateral effect or damage of functioning societies? But if we begin a new whatever, you know, is racism up on the surface of, you know, how do we prioritize and plan so that we are aware of all of these impulses? So those are some of my own questions. And I'd like to then ask Laura, please.
Thank you, James. And then Sheila, I think you still need to go, right? Okay. So everything that everybody's mentioned had resonated with me as well. The one place that struck me as something that I needed to hold on to and take with me forward in this work is, at one point during the interview, he talks about Krista Tippett getting uncomfortable about talking about white supremacy or white body supremacy, and makes note of it. And they go into the conversation about, that's where he says we have to start the work. That's in that moment of discomfort, that moment that we feel what you were talking about, Tom, the discomfort of what's going on. That's where we need to stay and we need to do the work. And so holding that in my mind and realizing that and paying attention to that bodied experience of what we're talking about, that when I'm feeling that discomfort, to step into it rather than, oh, I need to go get comfortable. Hold on, let me take a breath. Let me do this. That kind of thing. The question I have, and I don't know the right answer to this at all, is he introduces a new term of bodies of culture. I've recently been introduced to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and now there's bodies of culture, and I don't want to get caught up in terms. So that's where my question is around this whole idea of terms and what to say and how to say it and all of that, and how many terms are evolving and getting tripped up into those. I don't want to get tripped into those in the work that I'm doing. So trying to figure out how to manage that. I took the practice, which I had very similar experiences with that everyone else did. This past Sunday, I preached on the history of the Wenatchee Native Americans and their land. And I took that practice that he introduced in the interview and had it throughout the service for people to be able to center themselves and ground themselves as we learned about this horrible history that had happened right in our valley, and what it calls us to do. And so it was a very valuable practice for me, and then also to bring back to my congregation. Sheila?
Thanks, Laura. I don't know how much more I have to add. Much of what everyone has said certainly resonated with me. I will say that the impact of the article just added another aspect of how to enter into all of this body of culture, this idea of white body supremacy, that holistic nature that says it's not just about head or about heart, it's about the whole of us. And that resonates with the health professional in me, certainly. the idea that this is all embedded into our DNA takes a little bit of process, but it also, to me, it has helped me just even looking at the concept helps me to step more into the idea of white supremacy and where I am inside of that body than just speaking about terms that are out here in ways that I've always seen it. So I found that helpful. And for the meditation, for the practice, it felt like meditation. And my takeaway about that is what I attempt to do anyway, which is just take a breath when things are crazy and notice what you notice, whether, or in my case, so notice what I notice, whether it's emotional or something that's around me, and just be aware of that, because the more I notice what I notice in the moment that I'm in, the more I'm likely to pick up the nuances of whatever's in front of me, whether it's this conversation or something else. So those are the things I would offer. Thanks.
Is there anybody else who'd like to speak to that last question about your experience with the practice? Some of us have already gone into that. Others not, I think, but I want to make sure that we all have an opportunity to maybe give a final thought, even if it's a little commercial size one.
To a little one. To me, you mentioned meditation in terms of just thoughtfulness of taking that time to feel where your body is at, and what makes you fearful, what makes you hopeful. And to me, that was it, to center myself and to see what was in front of me, what's beside me, what's on each side, was where are my fears and where are my hopes. And during this day and age, there's a lot of fears, and sometimes I lose track of my hopes. So sitting still makes me appreciate that kind of gratitude for the hopefulness of the future, not just the fear of the future. So we got a lot of distress going on in the world.
One thing that I just end with for me is that plays off what Karen said, which is the war outside is reflective of the war inside, and healing our community, our society begins internally with healing our own where we're conflicted, what we're not paying attention to, how we're disconnected from our from who we truly are, and I think that's something I will be continuing to reflect on in my own practices.
The one thing that I've been a coach, for kids sports a lot, and one of the things that I've shared with my kids as I've coached is that practice does not make perfect. Practice, in fact, makes permanent. And that to me is the value of this conversation, and a continuing journey of intentionality and practice, that if we step into that practice of understanding when we are in a place where we grab our purse and move it over, and by the way, I do carry a purse, so I can say that. When we have that moment to stay there and go through that practice, because as we do that, it seems to me that we are going to be able to rewrite that code and make permanent something else than the thing that is currently permanent. And that's my encouragement, I guess, to myself.
I think before we stop the recording, I'm just thinking about for myself, and to say that one of the choices that I have moving forward, along with feeling the kind of the pain and the guilt and perhaps even shame of what I either explicitly or implicitly participate in, one of my choices would be to shrink myself down, to take on meekness, I guess, in a sense. And I would probably most willingly do that. But I don't think that's what I'm being actually asked to do or be. And so not to withdraw from the conversation or the relationship circles or the problems, but actually try to see if there's a way to use the power that really is granted to me to be part of healing and wholeness around me. And I'm not sure the path on that, but I do think that shrinking down is for me personally, psychologically, it's probably not the best thing for me to do. Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in.